let's talk about the trouble with scope control. And in order to have a conversation about that, we're actually probably best to break that into three intimately related but distinct conversations. So a little bit later in the week, I want to talk about the turnaround premise. Turnaround premise being where scope control actually begins and where it has its roots. And we want to talk about the scope challenge, sometimes known as scope scrub. We'll talk about that later on in the week too. I'm going to propose that we keep both those terms in a sort of belt and suspenders type protection methodology. And today, we're going to actually talk about our scope control process. How will we control our scope to the master scope list after scope challenge and prior to the completion of the turnaround? So in order to do that, we're going to need to break our scope control process into several distinct parts. It's best to think of it that way. We would have an added work process for approval. We would have a removed work process for approval, and we would have a found work process for approval. Now, a lot of people are combining added work and found work, seeing it as two sides of the same coin. Primarily for data control and manipulation purposes, I would advise you not to do that. Added work that comes in after scope challenge and prior to execution is a very large part work that was forgotten during scope gathering. So it's useful to have that distinctly separated out so that we can address that in future turnarounds and maybe create a more efficient scope gathering process. Removed work should always have a process, because let's remember, anything that's on your master scope list has been approved at the strategy team level, is a part of your budget approval, and you don't necessarily want to remove work without the same approval level that put it on there, let's say. And a found work process, again, that's separating it out from the added work, because again, if we can pull the actual genuine found work file after the fact, we might be able to identify weaknesses and performance improvement opportunities in our integrity program. So that gives us an added work process, a removed work process, and a found work process. Now, the trouble with the scope control process, the strategy team is generally too far away, and let's face it, mostly your strategy team will be made up with general managers and vice presidents. They're not really at the right level to be dealing with the day-to-day fluctuations in requests for scope addition. So it's not going to be possible to be timely, in other words, for the strategy team. The steering team, on the other hand, is sort of an opposite problem. They're way too close to the work. They're too close to the operators. They're too close to the maintenance people. They're too personally invested in the facility, which is how we would like them to be, but they're too personally invested to be truly impartial in their decision making. So this is where we can help. Your Advando Senior Advisor, if we're there on a subscription service for 2 days a month or 3 days a month or a week a month, in addition to having facilitated your readiness reviews and making sure we're 100% ready when we hit the turnaround execution, we could also be helping you by administering as cold eyes your scope control process. And we would administer that in an impartial way to work that either meets or does not meet the dictates of the turnaround premise. And let's be clear, all work that's not compliant with the turnaround process, that ultimately has to go all the way up to the same approval level that the turnaround master scope list was approved at in the first place. So first, the steering team would need to look at that, and then if they are, convinced that this non-compliant work is worthy of exception, it would be the steering team that would sell that exception idea to the strategy team. Because let's be clear here, a lot of this work that we're talking about that's going to come in, is going to be completely not compliant to our turnaround process, is going to need some extra funding. And we all know what level we have to go to get that extra funding. So One final note on this before I close. Approval of work that is not in your turnaround premise, that should be a very rare exception. And we're going to talk about that in building a meaningful turnaround process later on in the week. For now, let's talk later. Peace out.